Hey everybody, so I want to do a very succinct review, which is going to be incredibly close to your paper. So look at the slides. I'm trying to centralize them and distill them more down to its essence. I'm going to put up a couple of terms as well that will be on the test, so know them. The test is going to be 5 multiple choice questions that are going to be worth 4 points each. That's 20 points. Then define 10 out of 20 terms. We'll go over those terms in a second. Those will be worth 2 points each. And then 3 out of 6 essays with 1 essay for extra credit. I'm going to look at all of them now. So for one, I mean, we have covered so much time in this class, from the fall of Constantinople and the arrival of Columbus in the New World, through the American Revolution, what leads to the American Revolution, the Civil War, Reconstruction, all the way up to the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, the World Wars, up to the Cold War. So we've covered a lot. So I'm going to pull up the terms for a second. So terms to know. Take a screenshot of this. I'm going to put them up. Know what these places are. Now, for one, terms to know is a very vague definition that I'll be asking people. Tell me about these events, these acts, these laws, these cases, these events. Know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments, they're going to show up in the test in one way, shape, or form. Know what the Black Legend is. The Black Legend that everything that came from Europe, or i.e. Spain, was bad. Know what the Wagner Act. Wagner Act was during the New Deal. The New Deal was FDR's program to get America back on track. Wagner Act allowed collective bargaining for employees against their employers. So unionization. Know who Susan B. Anthony was. Know the Salem witch trials and the fact that it also represents this moment where we stop in the colonial period, really understanding the world through a religious lens. Start to see a little secularism start seeping into American society. Know what the Stamp Act is. Townshend Act, right? 2 very, very important acts during the American Revolution. Stamp Act was the act on all printed materials. Townshend Act was the act on all imported goods, mostly high-end stuff, your wines. Brown v. Board of Education, know when it happened, what was the ruling of it, what did it kind of get rid of in terms of previous court case, separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown versus Board of Education got rid of segregation in schools, and there will be pushback from that from Southern school boards. Civil Rights Act of 1866. Know that it's during Reconstruction. It is when the radicals took back Reconstruction from presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. Know what amendment comes out of that. Woodrow Wilson, president during World War I, issues the 14 points. The Lusitania is a ship that sinks by German U-boats. That gets us involved in World War I. Also, the Zimmerman note is the other reason we get involved. The note from the Germans to the Mexican government to get involved in the war. 3/5 clause as a compromise during the Constitution. What did it do? Who is it kind of affecting? Which part of the country is arguing for it? New Jersey plan as well as the Constitution. What does New Jersey kind of propose in terms of a Congress? Monroe Doctrine. What is the Monroe Doctrine? Who is President Monroe trying to intimidate or tell to not involve themselves in the Western Hemisphere? Plessy versus Ferguson is tied to Board v. Education. Plessy is the rail car in New Orleans that Homer Plessy sits on, is told to leave. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, but at that moment, the court rules against civil rights and argues that separate but equal will be the law of the land. Know what the Underground Railroad was? Know who was on it, where they're trying to get to, obviously Canada, or free the abolitionist North, but also eventually to Canada. Fugitive Slave Act, know how that relates to federal law in terms of the Constitution, the idea that there is no free land. Gettysburg, the turning point battle of the Civil War, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was for during the Progressive Era for some oversight into the quality of food that people are buying. The 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in '63 after the Battle of Antietam to free those enslaved in states in rebellion. Truman's containment policy, how does that correlate to the Cold War? We're going to contain communism in parts of the world, either through diplomatic, military, or economic means. You know who Booker T. Washington was, civil rights leader from the South, the theory of accommodation, the fact that if African Americans are good workers, they can then get jobs. Know the Black Codes, know when they happened and who institutes them. Presidential Reconstruction, state laws kind of restricting the lives of African Americans. Prohibition. Prohibition is the law that outlawed alcohol in the 1920s. Imperialism, the process of influencing a country through diplomatic, military, economic means. When America becomes an imperialistic country as well at the turn of the 20th century. Manifest Destiny. 15th Amendment in terms of the last of the Reconstruction Amendments. Know the president that signs it, know why it's put in. Know that the 15th Amendment is the right to vote for African Americans in response to the Black Codes, and not only from that, using federal power to enfranchise people, but also the fact that it leads to a lot of high rise in African American voting in the South. Margaret Sanger, the nurse during Progressive Era for birth control. Hull House, know that Hull House, what was Hull House set up for? What was the goal of Hull House during the Progressive Era? Maybe who ran Hull House? Jane Addams running Hull House. And know why it's important. It is the first social settlement, but where immigrants could gather to learn, receive care, food, the tools necessary to kind of ease the transition to a new home. So Hull House is incredibly connected to the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age. Eugenics, the idea of science being able to eradicate certain unwanted traits in humanity, whether it be crime, whether that be alcoholism, and also can we use scientific means to make humanity better. WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration, during the New Deal, what was it trying to do? The Lend-Lease Acts during World War II, giving money to the European powers to fight the Germans' Nazi regime, and also the United Nations as a place to come together to avoid international war and conflict after the first two wars. Now, continuing along, the fall of Constantinople, 1453, that gets Europe looking to the west. That is why Europe will decide to go west. And that leads us to Columbus. Christopher Columbus will arrive in the New World in 1492. But what I really want us to focus on, pull it up here. Oh, wait. There will be a potential essay question on the features and patterns of Native American life before European arrival. What was life in America before? Eventually, we know that they came over the Bering Strait. That's how humanity kind of gathers over that. The last ice age, glacier expanded, the herds come down. The people who eventually become the Native Americans settle and follow the herds to the south. Eventually, that is where we get the Native American tribes, and their society is incredibly different than Europeans. Land, religion, and gender. They have 3 different viewpoints on that. The idea of private property is foreign to them. Wealth and material goods are not sought after, and many Indian societies were matrilineal, meaning women occupied positions of power. Europeans felt that natives lacked genuine religion, claimed that they did not use the land the way European perspective claimed, and European viewed Indian men as weak and Indian women as mistreated. Native Americans could divorce, women could divorce, hold positions of leadership. Premarital sex is not frowned upon, and children stayed with the mother, which is the complete opposite of European society, where women didn't really have the power to divorce, hold positions of leadership, have many legal rights in terms of land ownership. Premarital sex is frowned upon, and usually children stayed with the father. Their concept of freedom was very, very different. Native Americans, Europeans concluded that freedom, or the European notion of freedom, land ownership, to own land as a mechanism for freedom, was alien to Indian societies. Native Americans were barbaric to the Europeans because they were too free, and European understanding of freedom was based on personal independence and the ownership of private property, 2 foreign ideas to Native Americans. Now, another major factor of Native American society is the fact that if you stole in Native American society, it was very, very much frowned upon. And then 2, they didn't have much homelessness. The tribe took care of a lot of its own people. Now, what happened when the Native Americans came into contact with Europeans? Well, for one, it evolves over time. First, there's curiosity, there's intrigue. Who are these people? And then eventually they start trying to feel each other out. But we do see conflict. Europeans will come looking for land, looking for land ownership. They will steal from the Native Americans, but also the big one would be disease. Europeans brought diseases. Now, after they come into contact, a lot of the European Native American communities will be killed off by the Europeans by their disease and war. You can look at what Columbus did, what the conquistadors under Cortez did, with the Aztecs. But we also have the exchange, right? The Columbian exchange, goods and vegetables being traded from the old world to the new world. So we do have this kind of backwards and forward. And then what happened for the most part is focus on the diseases. Moving forward, right, we have some very influential Enlightenment thinkers. Thomas Hobbes is our very cynical Enlightenment leader. He takes readers back to the state of nature, how governments arise, and to what extent do we obey governments and leaders. To Hobbes, life is nasty, short, and brutish before governments. We make governments out of fear, and we should obey that government regardless of whether we like them or not. The other one will be Rousseau. Rousseau kind of is on the other end of the spectrum. Very, very much an anti-modernist, so to speak. Thinks that life is addicted to progress, and that those, like Native Americans, live really good, pure lives in harmony with nature, with a simple respect for music. On the other end, the most influential of the American founding is John Locke. Now, the American Declaration is founded on the principles of the Enlightenment. You know that. The Enlightenment principles are what influenced the largest our founding documents. John Locke believes in the state of nature is not totally so bad and it's not so good. It kind of exists in the middle, and we take a little from We give up a little bit of power to make our lives better. Now, the age of revolution. We'll see the Enlightenment bring about major changes in France, America, and Haiti. Talking about the road to the revolution, American colonists, right, coming out of the French and Indian War, where France and England fought in the New World. England would win, removing France from the New World, but also Americans at the end of that war are really, really happy to be English. They feel as though this is the French and Indian War proved that the English society is the best and the most free. That the English were that the Americans were treated as Englishmen who just didn't live in London. So the French and Indian War, the Americans come out of it very proud to be British, but then British government changes policy towards the American colonists. And that's where we kind of get the road to the revolution. So after England defeats France, England has to pay for the war. And so they decide to tax the Americans. And the first tax they will do will be the Stamp Act. Stamp Act is one of the first major events that sharpened the divisions between America and the English. Stamp Act would see Parliament attempt to raise money by direct tax rather than through the regulation of trade, a new departure in imperial policy, tax on printed materials, books, newspapers, court documents, land deeds. It affects everybody. This will anger the colonists. The opposition to the Stamp Act is the first great drama of the Revolutionary period. And this is where we start to see the split between Americans and Great Britain. The difference in views of the empire, right? As they change policy with the Stamp Act, Americans start to realize that they are not in a relationship of equals. The British viewed them as a system of unequals. If you're English and you live in London, you're a first-class citizen, but if you're in America, you're a colonial subject, you're a second-class citizen. Americans will come back with the argument of no taxation without representation. Then we have the Townshend Act, 1767. Imposes tax on imported goods. And we have the Boston Massacre, where we see five Bostonians killed in March of 1770. This is the first act of violence. It's kind of, now we're really on the road to the American Revolution. Then we see the tea crisis. The Boston Tea Party is where the British government tries to bail out a failing tea company by taxing American colonists to get that business out of the red, so to speak. Colonists know that a new shipment is going to arrive in December, and a group of colonists will dress as Native Americans, throw over 300 chests of tea into the water. It becomes known as the Boston Tea Party, and the cost would be $4 million today. More events that sharpen the divide. The British start to hire Hessians to put down the rebellion in the colonies. So the hiring of mercenaries, the burning of Falmouth and Norfolk by the British brings the South closer to the revolutionary desire. And then the governor of Virginia promised freedom to slaves who would fight for the British. The impact persuaded many Southern colonial elites to join New England in the war effort. Now, we do then see Common Sense. This is an event that sharpens the divide. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, argues for independence and becomes an international bestseller. And then we have the eventual writing of the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson with Adams and Franklin. And the Declaration of Independence expressed and reflected Enlightenment values and ideas. For one, the preamble is heavily influenced by Locke, stating that the rights of the colonists to break away if natural rights were violated, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, we change it to happiness, and stating that all men are created equal. So we see within the founding document, the Declaration of Independence, a lot of Enlightenment influence. The idea that government is founded by people, for the people, and that power rests in the people, and then we give it over to the government rather than divine right. God has chosen this family or this person to rule as king or queen, and hence their hereditary lineage would be the rulers of the country. We're avoiding that with saying a direct democracy based on the will of the people. People have the power to vote, to exercise democratic principles and political voice in that. And if that government doesn't adhere to that, it is the right of the people to break away and start a new government. Now, we have the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation is the founding document through that gets us through the American Revolution, and it's combining both strengths and weaknesses. For one, strengths, it gets us through the American Revolution. It is the first written American document of the United States that starts to break away power from England. It is also allows us to make treaties and declare war, and also collective protection if something happened to, let's say, one of the states. One thing we see from the American Revolution is Boston at the beginning having to convince the other colonies that we're on the same team. Now we know we're on the same team. So there, in case we're invaded by whoever, there won't be a first Continental Congress and a second one. We know that we'll have a defense ready. We also have the Northwest Ordinances that sets up the land won in the Revolution to be brought into the greater body politic and eventually become states. But there's many, many weaknesses. For one, we don't pay the veterans. They can't really raise money, regulate tax, and so we can't pay our bills. So we have strengths like gets us through the revolution, but a weakness is it doesn't allow us to raise tax. It's also set up as a supermajority where you need 13 out of 13 states to pass a law, and then you need 9 out of 13 to amend a law. You need a supermajority and a unanimous decision to get anything done. Delegates weren't made to go to the government in a mandatory sense, so a lot of things couldn't get done. So if you're not making people have to go to the government, and power rests not in the centralized government, but in the states, the central government then has no power. It couldn't regulate taxes, it couldn't regulate interstate trade. The Articles of Confederation did not allow for a judicial, an executive, and only one branch of Congress. After Shays' Rebellion, we realized that we have to make a new Constitution, and we come up with what is now the American Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. And it's made of many, many compromises. For one, the debate centered on how to balance federal and state governments and the interests of large states and small states. One plan will be the Virginia plan, proposed by Virginia, 2-house legislature with a state's population determining representation in each. States feared the more populous states, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, would dominate the new government. That would be responded to with the New Jersey plan, calling for a single house Congress in which each state has one vote, same as the Articles of Confederation. The compromise that was reached, a 2-house Congress consisting of a Senate in which each state had 2 members, and then a House of Representatives apportioned by population. So one of the great compromises, the great compromise, is our bicameral House. The Senate, where everybody, no matter how big or small in terms of the state, gets 2 representatives, and then based on population, we'll see the House of Representatives. Now, the next compromise would be, what do you do with the enslaved population? The enslaved population by the South is arguing to be counted as 1. That would increase Southern power in the House of Representatives. The North is arguing for 0. The compromise that will be reached that is 3/5 of an entire slaves population will be counted towards House of Representative votes. It's not an actual person being cut off at the knees. It is taking 3/5 of the entire slave population and putting that towards representation. To get that compromise, the South wanted 20 years of importation of slaves and the Fugitive Slave Act, meaning that the federal government had power to go into places like Massachusetts, which outlawed slavery, and catch escaped slaves from the South and bring them to the South. So we see the South get a federal power that overrides state power. So for the 3/5 clause on how to count the enslaved population, we see the Fugitive Slave Act come about, 20 years of importation of slave, and 3/5 of the slave population counted towards representation. All of this is trying to start to ease the tensions between North and South. We also have federalism, balancing between federal and state government, the divisions of powers, and the system of checks and balances. The Constitution greatly strengthened national authority, but it seeks to prevent one branch from dominating over another. Another compromise would be the Electoral College, how we choose the president. The president is to be chosen by the Electoral College or the House if there is a tie, but the Electoral College is an indirect means to elect the president because the delegates do not trust ordinary voters to choose the president and vice president directly. So when you're asked, what were the major compromises? Federalism, balancing state power and federal power. The New Jersey plan, Virginia plan, resulting in the Great Compromise, expands upon those, and also the 3/5 clause. Now, as we get closer to the Civil War, why does slavery become the major defining issue, divisive issue in the 1840s and 1850s? For one, slavery is not dying a natural death. It starts to see it's expanding, and especially with the cotton gin. The cotton gin will come around, and with that invention, we see slavery start to try to expand to the Western territories after the French sell the Louisiana Purchase to the Americans. So we get this huge swath of land, the Louisiana Purchase, and now we have to decide how are we going to break it up? Is it going to be slave states or free states? That will result in balance of power in the federal government. So politically, we're divided over what to do with all this new land in the French Louisiana Purchase. Then we see a new commodity in cotton that is going to expand the institution or the economic power of it, combined with racism that is increasing in the South as it becomes a very, very white supremacist society. And then we have the political failures of Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott case, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So know those. But why is the Civil War considered the first modern war? Well, we start to see the tactics of the war change. We see technology influencing war greatly. We see Sherman burning Atlanta, burning the South. So we start to see wars and battles fought in fields, moving from just in farm country to making wars on society. And then we see trench warfare that will kind of foreshadow the First World War. Now, the meaning of the war changes. Now, we know the war is about slavery, but it does change in the middle of the war. The North is losing, and Lincoln will redefine the American Civil War by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 after the Battle of Antietam, which goes into effect in 1863, which freed slaves in states in rebellion, not the border states. And those people that were freed, a lot of them went and fought in the Union Army. And so they then become members of the Union Army fighting for their own freedom. Moving on to the industrial, Gilded Age. At least for the amendments, know that the 13th abolishes slavery under Lincoln, 14th under Johnson citizenship, 15th under Grant for voting rights. When we get to the Gilded Age, next period is the Gilded Age. Know the four izations of the Gilded Age. There will be a question on this: industrialization, unionization, immigration, urbanization. The industrial Gilded Age uncovered many new problems of the modern era. So we're going to see capitalism run amok, and then the progressives try to rein in and correct those problems that were uncovered. Industrialization. Industrialization is the building of new factories and how labor is being redefined. Factory work, industrializing the society, the railroad, all these new places where people are working, known as the Second Gilded Age, Second Industrial Revolution, sorry. Industrialization and these new jobs uncovered the problem of work environment. Work was deadly. People were taken advantage of. They were exploited at work. And you see the beginnings of the first labor movement. And a lot of these people who are working there many are immigrants. They come from Eastern Europe, which is where the communist Karl Marx is from, and his writings were very, very influential there. And we get the desire for unionization. Workers start arguing for better working conditions, the right to collective bargain, and in some cases, ownership of the property of the actual factory. Immigration, we see during the Gilded Age a huge amount of people coming to the American, to the shores of America, looking for a new life, escaping political persecution and religious persecution. Also the availability of jobs, and they come and live close to where these jobs are in the city. And we see these all new problems of urbanization. What are you going to do with housing? Building enough housing to protect, to house the people. Tenement buildings. What about plumbing, air quality, garbage, fire department, policing? All these new problems that were going to be uncovered during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So these new problems that immigration, urbanization, unionization, political corruption, and industrialization uncovered while capitalism ran amok and monopolies were created, were going to be fought back against by the progressives. They're going to try to fix these problems. They're going to try to make industrialization, of society and of labor. And they're realists. They're not arguing to go back to a completely agrarian society, but can we make modern work, industrialized work, more humane? Should workers be allowed to unionize and to collectively bargain for their workers' rights? What rights does a worker have? How many hours should they work? Should they get unemployment benefits? What happens if somebody gets hurt? What happens if the factory closes? All these problems that come up with that a union would advocate for. Immigration. Places like Hull House would be created to ease the transition of immigrants from their previous country to their new country. And urbanization. People are living in the city. The city is having a problem adhering and addressing these new problems. So we start to see the progressives use lawyers, scientists, educators, try to correct the problems that were uncovered during the Gilded Age. Scientific means kind of curbing democracy, so to speak. And one of them would be like making the city beautiful, the beautification of the city, planting trees, making parks, central parks. The iconic event would be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Know that factory fire. The factory fire. So know the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Know what happened, where it happened. Workers were locked in their job to avoid workers taking breaks. chatting, not working, and also to keep union organizers out of the factory floor, and how a fire broke out, the women couldn't get out, they are locked in with little to no options. Many jumped to their deaths. The FDNY got there, they couldn't get up to the top floor, to the floor, because their ladders and hoses didn't reach. And so it uncovers the problem that the city's not making enough changes to keep up with the changing pace of this urbanization, but also that workers are being taken advantage of, and especially women. So from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, we see the women's movement and the labor movement go into high gear. This kind of leads us right to the women's suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment. Know what the 19th Amendment is. After America wins during the at the tail end of the progressive era, we enter World War One. World War One would be one of the first great tragedy of the 20th century, worldwide tragedy. Militarism, imperialism, revolution, secret alliances, colonialism, nationalism, all led the European powers to war. Militarism is building up your army. Imperialism is, as we mentioned before, influencing a country's economy and government. Revolution, we see the Russian Revolution kind of destabilize not only Russia, but the Balkans, Ireland as well. Secret alliances that eventually domino effect into the First World War. We don't have a kind of public forum like the UN. Nationalism, combining with nations wanting to have independence, be self-determining, and self-determination, combined with colonialism, led Europe to the first great tragedy. The assassination of the Archduke is what causes the war, but at home, we will see the 19th Amendment passed. Know the 19th Amendment prohibits states and federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex. This is women's suffrage. Women have entered the workforce. They are now working in a lot of the factories, and it's been a long, arduous road for women's suffrage, and it ends with the 19th Amendment. We enter the 1920s. 1920s would be a very, very fun decade. Think of it as the great party decade, and one where we start to see really modern American society created. We are the creditor nation, everybody owes us money, and we start enjoying ourselves for about 20 years. Know that American lives daily changed with time-saving devices such as vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators, but also the fact that we now mostly live in the city. The defining law of the decade would be prohibition, which would be enacted by the Volstead Act in 1919. The end of the Great Depression, 1920s, we'll see the Great Depression, and we see three of the main causes of the Great Depression would be, as we mentioned here, domestically, land is remaining underdeveloped. We start to see mortgages foreclosed, banks failing, real estate speculation. One of the causes of the Great Depression is a weak banking system. So we have a weak banking system that is speculating on the stock market, combined with European demand for American goods declining because industry in Europe is recovering from the war, and the stock market crash of 1929. Those would be the main causes of the Great Depression. Long-term causes as well. We see major industries affected by the rise of new materials. Cotton industry in the Deep South affected by the rise of synthetic materials. The railroad industry is affected by cars and airplane travel. Also, consumers began to spend less on goods. We start to see underconsumption, restrictive immigration laws, and also internationally, we institute the Hawley-Smoot tariff, one of the worst international trade policies. It couldn't come at a worse time. It was a tax on foreign imports to the United States, and 23 nations hit us back with imports on our goods. That will lead us to the New Deal. The New Deal, FDR's plan to get American economy back on track. What were the major policy initiatives and how did it recast the meaning of freedom in America? Well, for one, the government now understands that to be free means economic security. Not owning land like in the colonial period, but economic security. People can wake up one morning and it's not based on how hard they work or not how hard they work, their own self-reliance or laziness, but they can wake up and the stock market crashes for whatever reason and they are wiped out. That is not how because they lack some sort of character or they have a character flaw. So the recasting of the meaning of American freedom will be economic. Are you able to pay your bills? Now, FDR's initiatives are many. We'll take a quick look at a few. The workers, the FDR administration, for one, in terms of public policy, spent more money on roads, dams, airports, bridges, housing than any other activity. So the New Deal, some of the policies, it's to get Americans back to work. For one, the New Deal is the FDR and his administration saw practical solutions to the economic problems, and it is an unprecedented amount of legislation that would be passed. For one, the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. Relief, short term, bowl of food for people. Recovery, medium term, FDR's twin pillars, one for the urban sector and one for agriculture, the NIRA for urbans and the AAA for agriculture. Reform, long term, a permanent role. A lot of the progressive ideas would be policy initiatives, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, minimum wage, restrictions on child labor, development of natural resources. Another ones, Workers' Progress Administration, the WPA, employed nearly 9 million people on public projects such as buildings, bridges, airports, schools. Federal Arts Program, part-time occupation for actors, musicians, and writers to do work for the federal government. The National Industrial Recovery Administration, the NIRA, New Deal's biggest attempt to get industry back on track. Avoid extreme competition, labor management disputes, and overproduction. Agricultural Administration attempted to limit price-depressing surpluses by paying growers to reduce crop acreage. Agricultural Adjustment Administration, in a nutshell, is to get farming back on track. Then we have the Wagner Act, the most important piece of labor legislation in U.S. history, reasserted the right of labor to engage in self-organization and to bargain collectively through their own representatives. Social Security Act, one of the most far-reaching laws to ever pass Congress, inspired by highly industrialized nations of Europe, provided federal, state unemployment, insurance, old age, pension for retired workers. Also, the FDIC, which would insure your money in a bank. Just a couple of more acts from the New Deal. Emergency Banking Relief Act gave Treasury to open up sound banks. Homeowners Loan Corporation refinanced mortgages on about 100 million non-farm homes. Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, $5,000 were federally insured. Securities and Exchange Commission protects the public against fraud, deception, and inside manipulation of stock market. So what you have is NIRA, AAA, Federal Arts Project, the Workers' Progress Administration, the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, SEC, looking over Wall Street, Public Works Administration, getting people back to work, Emergency Banking Relief Act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and Social Security. Social Security will be one of the longest lasting initiatives of the New Deal. Now, the first New Deal was one, to get society out of the Depression. So the first one focuses on the economic recovery. The second would be economic security. And that would be like Social Security and really far long-reaching initiatives. How the New Deal impacted the lives of American citizens? Well, for one, many Americans would get, unemployment, even though it remained high, goes down from 25% to 14%. Manufacturing and salaries increased by 50%. Farm incomes doubled. It did do more for white working class male than it did for anybody else, immigrants, women, and African Americans. But it was one of the biggest pieces of legislation to ever pass in America. Now, there'll be a question on the Cold War. What is the Cold War? The Cold War is the post-World War II conflict between the United States and the USSR. Why is it called the Cold War? For one, after the atomic bomb, the fear of the bomb meant that these two competing superpowers had to figure out a way to not go to war, but defeat each other. So we weaponize money, we weaponize culture, we weaponize proxy wars. We actually have an arms race just to kind of intimidate the other side. So like what events, security interests, and ideological conflicts prompted the Cold War? Well, for one, events, World War II. The United States and USSR in a simple way don't get along too well during World War II. We don't share this atomic secrets with them, and we don't open up the front, the second front, well into late in the war. So if you had to look at events during World War II, we don't give them the atomic secrets, we don't share them, and we don't open the second front. Security interests, well, in terms of security interests, we are threatening the Soviet Union with missiles in Europe. Eventually, Cuba will be a threat to the United States with the Soviet missiles there. We're fighting security interests in Berlin and also Western Germany and the Berlin crisis. And then we have ideological conflicts. The ideological conflict is in the new developing third world that is decolonizing after France and England are giving up their empire holdings. And we have one is a Western liberal democracy based in capitalism, right? U.S. believe in a capitalistic economy in which private citizens own private property. They celebrated individualism, free speech, religion, and democratic elections. The USSR believed modern society would eliminate religion and private property and collective good over individual. They're communists. So we have communism versus capitalism. Communism is based on the writings of Karl Marx. Capitalism is based on the writings of Adam Smith. Now, how did the Cold War reshape ideas of American freedom, both culturally and domestically? Well, for one, it increases paranoia in America. In the 1950s, we become a very conformist society. And then, because of the Cold War and proxy wars in Korea, and most notably Vietnam, we see the generational warfare between the anti-war movement in the 60s. Internationally, we view the world through the lens of those with freedom and those without. And we still have this today. We kind of remove all nuance from America's worldview, even when it comes to proxy wars. Even if you're just fighting the communists and you're not really a democratic society, we will support you because you're anti-communist. We do that in Vietnam. We do that in Korea. So in terms of, let me see, events, security interests, know what the Marshall Plan is, know that the Marshall Plan was the economic plan, weaponizing American money to rebuild Europe and Japan after World War II, and trying to use that money to make nations want to come onto the American side of the Cold War. So know how the Cold War reshaped the ideas of American freedom, know what events and ideological conflicts prompted the Cold War. What's the difference between the USSR and the USA? Let's see what else. Know the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that ruled racially segregated public schools are unconstitutional. Know what Plessy versus Ferguson's ruling was in terms of separate but equal. Know what the Emancipation Proclamation did. Know that the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are influenced by John Locke and the theories of the Enlightenment. Know that the major weaknesses of know many of the major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, mostly that the government could not enforce its laws. The belief that the United States should expand across the continent. Know what that is. Know that is manifest destiny. And know Lincoln's 10% plan. What did it try to do? What was his goal with his 10% plan? You can take a look at these slides. They'll be posted. Watch this video. Stay very, very close to it. I'll also post the definitions as well.